Hey guys, welcome back. To those of you who watched and shared my first video, sent it to your friends, thank you so much. I really got a lot of good feedback on that and that was exciting. So if you guys wouldn't mind to share this video as well, get the word out there, spread the message, that would be great. My name's Allie. I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving, good food, good friends, good family. Maybe if you're lucky, you had a good political conversation, because as awkward and painful as it can be, one of the things I'm going to talk to you about today is I'm going to let you in on some government secrets and the things that the elites and the politicians and pretty much the people with money don't want you to know. And one of those things is that they want to control two things, and that's our money and the power of, or the spread of information. So they really don't care if you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're in the middle, you lean left, you lean right. They really don't care what you believe in as long as we disagree. So the best thing that we can do is to talk to one another, learn from one another, and even though we might not agree on things all the time, learning that we have more in common than we do differently is really important. But today specifically we're going to talk about the money. So we're going to talk about capitalism, but more importantly, we're going to talk about the illusion of capitalism. And we're going to get into what that means in a minute. But first we'll talk about capitalism. So capitalism is pretty much the economic system that we have, which means we have private businesses, private investment. If I want to go and start a business tomorrow, I am able to do that with limited barriers to entry and competition. And for capitalism to work efficiently, you need two big things for it to work well. And that's, the first one is limited government. And the second thing for it to work well is competition. So when we have really heavy competition and the government is just there to make sure nobody's cheating, everything's running efficiently, maybe even the government gets a little bit of money to do the things that our capitalism isn't effectively getting us. That could be things like water and energy, but we might get into a little bit later how even the fact that those are monopolized and the government owns them might not necessarily be a good thing. So if these are working efficiently, we can have a good, healthy capitalist society. Money flows, money is well distributed, there's opportunity. It will increase the likelihood that you're having a good job that you want and that everyone is getting paid well, and we'll need even less government interference on the other side. But today we see that we have a lot of issues with competition and limited government, and that's because of one thing. So fundamentally, power equals money. One of the heads of the families that we'll talk about later that is kind of manufacturing this illusion of capitalism we had once said that he cares not who makes the laws as long as he's in control of the money, basically saying that money can be even more powerful than law, which is what we've seen. But the problem is that those people want you poor. So there's a large group of people, and it's not on either side of the aisle. It's a system that sits above our ground politics, and even to an extent above a lot of the people that you want to look at and point fingers at, above the elite class. And they make their money off of us, off of keeping us poor, and they do that in a lot of ways. So over the last at least 100 or so years, these families have been around for about 200 years, but we really started to see them making moves right around the turn of the 1900s, so late 1800s. These families start buying up a lot of industries, a lot of businesses, most importantly the banks, and they started making changes in the government and in the actual ground running business fields to slowly start taking our money and our power, our influence away, without really them being noticed until the age of technology, where we can now go back and see how much they own and see who they've hired and the companies that they own without being on paper that they own, the different changes that have come over time following the influence and the money. We're starting to see that it really isn't, that pretty much a lot of the financial issues that we're having in society today have kind of been put in place on purpose. And so some of the tools that they use to keep you poor is taxes. So the way a capitalist economy is meant to happen, we're not meant to have income tax. It actually was not legal in the founding of our country to have income tax, and somewhere along the line, there's probably better videos on this, but they changed the loophole and started taxing us, and now we're seeing upwards up to 20-30+% of your money gets pulled out of your check every week for taxes and other government run benefits that we receive from our paychecks. But that's not really how it's supposed to be. So another thing that they have instilled in our society is debt. A good capitalistic economy runs on minimal debt. And this comes in all areas. It's not only like taking out absurd student loan debts, which in a lot of cases, college is kind of just a giant pyramid scheme to get you to feed into the companies that they already have in place, instead of telling you that you can go and make and do your own thing because the competition is crazy. But it's also things like years ago, you bought your car, you saved up, you bought the whole thing, or you paid it off in a couple of years and you kept running it. Well, now you pay it off in 5-6 years, or you take out a loan, or you lease it, and then you're paying a car payment literally forever if you're in a cycle of leasing, which a lot of people are, and a lot of times they'll sell it to people who can't afford cars. So a lot of times we have in mind that it's for the wealthier people who do leasing, but it's actually a lot of people who don't have money for a car will take the leasing route, which with the idea that they can have a nicer car, but then really in 4 years they don't own anything. So if they didn't have the money now, maybe it's not the best idea to go the leasing option, because then additionally the government literally owns you on, not only is it money that you owe, a debt that you owe, but a lot of times they'll put a tracker in their car. If they don't make the payment, they'll just repo it right then and there. They know where it is, doesn't matter. And then even you look at houses. A lot of times it was a very common thing before for people to pay off their houses in only, a matter of years, like a decade would be normal per se. And now we have a lot of people get into these 30-year mortgages. We've got endless interest accruing on your car, on your house, on your student loans, on who knows what else you've taken loans out for, maybe starting your own business. All of these things we pay interest on and we don't actually own. So in that sense, we are forced to bend the knee to the government, I guess, and do whatever it is that they want us to do, because we're not completely free, because we owe them something. And a lot of that started to change during the crazy inflation we had in the 70s, I believe. A lot of that didn't balance back out, so the value of our money went crazy down. And then today, a lot of times people talk about how our wages haven't been adjusted to it, which that is one thing that's problematic, is that our wages haven't caught up to the price of living, but at the same time, the price of living is like way too high. Like, we can look at the bottom dollar, but really the clog comes because our society is no longer a well-oiled capitalist society. We actually are a lot closer, I would say, to socialism than we are to capitalism. But because we don't acknowledge that we're running that way, it's kind of hard for it to even work effectively, because there's all these, technically the government isn't interfering that much, and technically there's free competition, so we're kind of running in this like giant hodgepodge of both, and that's not quite working for us. And I think a lot of us have figured that out by now, but we haven't figured out how we got here, and the fact, and been able to put a label on it, that what we have today is not efficient capitalism. And so another thing that, then the inflation is another big one. And that inflation is pretty much the amount of money that's in the economy versus our GDP, which is the whole output of all the goods and services that we're running. So the money in versus how much we've created in relation to the value of a dollar, the price of a dollar. Like 5 cents in the 70s got you a whole lot more than 5 cents does today. So where it starts to get interesting is the inflation is controlled by the Federal Reserve. And where that gets interesting is we see this word here, federal. So that word implies that it's a government like owned, operated, controlled entity. But in reality, in 1913, we switched from like regular banking, open banking, to centralized banking. So pretty much all of our money funnels through a bunch of really big banks, and the Federal Reserve is made up by a collection of these banks. Chase Bank, some of the bigger names, I'm a little hesitant to say them at risk of getting a little violation on this video, but the Rockefellers, Carnegies, a lot of those banks that were big names that you might have remembered or heard of, they consider them, you kind of think, when you think of them, you think of like old America, building the buildings in New York and all that. They were wealthy families, but what they've done is they have put themselves kind of above the system, and they want us to think that they're no longer there, which is actually not true. They're controlling, pretty much they have almost total control over the money. So when inflation goes up or when inflation goes down, they will literally teach you in school that the Federal Reserve is there to keep us, what they like to say, in check. They're trying to keep us from having a booming economy to a busting economy, and they say that increasing and decreasing the inflation rates, the interest rates, the reserve rates, I'm missing a big one. I guess interest rates, both personal and banking. They say that by them manipulating it, they're protecting us. But in reality, when you start to look at the way they do it, the boom and bust is really, they say it's reactive, but it's actually a very, very thought out and researched way to keep us in check, to keep us from getting too powerful, too poor. And then when we have things like, then when we do have like the bust like we had in 2008, and all of a sudden, oh, there's a bailout, oh, like we have to bail out the banks need money. It's really, or like these other big companies that are all owned by these families, it's really, oh, we give them their money back, and then they lower all the rates, and then it looks like they come out and save us. But really, a lot of the reason we were there in the first place is because of them and because of how their system operates. Anyway, we'll get to that a little bit later. And then another thing they do is government assistance. Oh, I did really good in my grade school spelling bee, I swear. Assistance. Okay, and so that's another way that they kind of have ownership over you. So, like I said, they don't really care if you're left or you're right as long as we disagree. It's because they want to make sure that we as people we don't get enough power, we don't care enough or trust the system enough to really want to follow along, want to learn. That goes back to how, information-wise, they don't want us to start looking into these things, because then they know if we do, then we'll have to have a government and an economy that is working for the people, to enrich the people, and not to enrich these families up here. And so government assistance programs are really in place to keep people poor, to keep them from being able to get out of their cycle. There's a lot of stipulations. I actually just watched this video yesterday. Diamond and Silk explained it really well. Brendan Dilley has also done a really good explanation on how different social services are used by the government to keep people poor and also to change the way they vote. So they quite literally do promise people all of this stuff because they're like, oh, these are the people that are going to save us, these are the people that are going to help us. But then when you look at a lot of Democrat-run cities, you see years and years of continual Democrat governors, mayors, even in some states like senators, your big politicians that have a lot of this power. You see consistency in the voting, but you don't see consistency in progress. And that was what President Trump wanted to highlight when he was criticizing Baltimore. I forget what the guy's name was now, but he criticized him, and the news was trying to say that it was racist and stuff, but he was like, no, this guy's been in power for 40 years, he's been promising the community prosperity, he's gotten money for this, that, and the other, like millions and billions of dollars to do things like repave the streets, make better housing, like create jobs in your local inner city communities to get these people genuinely on their feet. And the point was, a lot of the money just disappeared, or appeared to go into, a lot of money would go into big projects that didn't really have a lot to show for it, or it would go into programs where they just continually funnel out money without putting these people in a place where they can actually take a step forward and thrive. And so that's why one of the big things that he's done in his administration is make opportunity zones in the inner cities, which is like crazy tax cuts for people who live in the cities, not for big people to come and put their McDonald's in the city or their Walmart or something, but like for the people who actually live there, and minorities get an extra cut. I believe the states got investment money. You'd have to check me on that. But pretty much over thousands of them throughout the country of cities and counties have been labeled opportunity zones, and the point of that was to bypass some of the government interference in keeping these areas poorer, and to cut past some of the competition, because clearly it's a lot easier for Walmart to go open a superstore than for someone that lives in the community to go and open up their own grocery store. So doing things that give people actual opportunities to thrive, instead of saying, well, if you make less than this, then you'll get this much money, so why would you want to make this much money or this much money when you'll get here and even out? And they kind of tell people like, you'll never get past this, and then with the way the legislation goes and the programs go and stuff, it really is actively keeping people from being empowered to move forward and wanting to succeed, which is also why they've wanted to decrease entrepreneurship. And with decreasing entrepreneurship, they also want to decrease just your overall like energy to work and to have a job and to find a good job that you care about. A lot of times we're told like get a job that will make you get good, or where you'll earn good money, or just like get through your week, like you're living to make money instead of like being encouraged to find something you're truly passionate about, or a place where you love the people you work with, or you're excited about doing what you're doing. They're like, no, just go work for a big company, play their game, do your time, make your money, feed your family. They just try to tell you like there's not really, it's like normal to hate your job, stuff like that. That's kind of more of the like mental side of how they are trying to keep the people overall, like the overall population in our society, poor. And that's not just the lower class. We'll see later about how a lot of these systems and barriers to efficient capitalism, they really do affect the 99%. It's not just the lower class, it's also affecting the middle class, the upper class. Pretty much if you're not like a billionaire elite or above, then pretty much this whole system is made to slowly beat you down, depower us, and eventually get us to give the power to them so that eventually we will just be like the elite's workforce. Pretty much is their final goal. So I mentioned before a lot of the families that are above the elites, which is your Federal Reserve families. It's a lot of your political families, like your old political families, celebrity families, and missing one. Oh, and then obviously your big business families. When you look into the businesses that do really well, a lot of times it happens overnight. You've got Nike, you've got Facebook, Twitter, the chicken, Arby's, Tyson. Like you look at all these companies and it's like they just went from being really small to owning everything. And it's crazy, even in like my business classes, I always wondered, I was like, especially like senior year, they taught us a lot that we need to focus on international business, and they were teaching us a lot of ways to like strategically, like how you want to make a big business and then you want to buy out all the smaller businesses and stuff. And it went even more in depth than that, but like I remember thinking like, isn't that kind of weird that like this is the business we're learning to take, that it's smart to take our manufacturing offshores. We were pretty much being taught into this big giant corporation business without even knowing it. And at the time I was like, oh, like they're teaching us these big strategies because you can always take something big and scale it down into small scale, like learning like things about like Toyota's efficiency and their production stuff. You're like, okay, like I can take what Toyota did over here and I can do that like at my small business, just learn the efficiency. But then the more and the more I started researching into like this whole plan for controlling the economy, and reading into like different ways our education system, because like I said, the two main things are money and information. So like when you think of like how the education system is or like reshaping our society and stuff, a lot of times you're like, oh, the global, there's this whole concept of the people up here, their end goal is to have a one world government where pretty much they control everything. They put everyone into their place, almost like a caste system. There'll be like no room for movement. The people will have no power, and the people at the top will have all the money, weapons, everything. Like, their end goal is to pretty much control everything. And so when you think about it, you're like, oh, a lot of times it's like the social sciences, in place in like your history and your English class, like those are like some more obvious majors, I guess, where they manipulate your worldview and the things that you believe in, and the things, I guess, even essentially that make you vote for what you vote. And you always think like, oh, business is kind of more of one of the conservative viewed majors and stuff. But then when you really take a step back and you look at it, I realized that business is almost just as corrupt, if not more, than a lot of the other majors you see. And the same thing can be said even in science and stuff, or like medicine, like the way that you're taught in school that it's normal to, like, if someone has, or even like psychology, let's say, if someone has a mental health issue, to just like first step figure out what medication they need to be on, when really it's like, well, maybe there's something in their life that, or their lifestyle, that is contributing heavily to where they're at first. Like, maybe let's try cutting down on sugar, increasing exercise, and then like therapy, like maybe that would be a good first step, instead of like, okay, let's get this kid on medicine and then we'll figure everything else out. Like, they're taught like that's your good first step. Same way in business, we're taught like it's all about profit, it's all about the cheapest way you can do that, and to do that is to diversify, own a bunch of different types of business that have as much in common on the supply chain as possible, and pretty much just like start absorbing different companies around you, whether they're similar or not. And the more that I'm like researching monopolies and stuff, it's like, oh, there was a like much bigger reason they were telling us like that's how it works. So they teach you how big business works, and then they kind of like also pretty heavily encourage you to go work for a big business. Like, and now the idea is like you go and you work for P&G, or you work for Nike or Google, or like one of these really big cool companies, and you just start somewhere and work your way up, and you're told like that's kind of your only option. So biggest threat to capitalism and competition is big business. So that hurts not only because now are you going to work for someone else, and you're not opening up your own businesses and stuff. That means that there's a very few companies or few people who kind of own everything, and then everyone else works for them. Or, for example, like throughout the 1900s, like a lot of families made their money running grocery stores, for example. So when you think about every Walmart, Kroger, Target, Meijer, Whole Foods, like every single grocery store that you have within one county or one city, or even like a square mile in some like more suburban places, we're like, oh, that's like, we can get cheaper food that way, like that's great. But then when you think about it, now we have, and some of those are even owned by the same companies or owned by bigger companies, like Amazon literally owns Whole Foods now. Like that to me is just crazy. So they tell you, well, your prices of your food will be cheaper, but like instead of having, say there's 10 like giant grocery stores in Mason, or like wherever you live, there's 10 grocery stores. That, let's say, puts at least 20 local grocery stores out of business. So that's 20 people who, instead of owning a business, are going to go work for somebody else. And that's instead of those 20 businesses getting produce from your local farmers, having your local companies ship and carry the food, having your local companies supply anything else that you might buy there. We now have, we've got Kroger, and Kroger works with these two giant farms that bought out all the other farms, and they send all their food to get produced by Tyson, who has bought out nearly every other chicken farm, and the list just goes on and on and on. When you look at how these 10 giant businesses come in and they put thousands and thousands and thousands of people out of work, of better paying, higher quality, like more passion driven jobs, more rewarding. If you're creating and doing something and putting effort into it and getting like real rewards out of it, it's going to be a lot more exciting than going to work every day, crunching numbers, or like just like, oh, my business got sold out. I specialized in in the grocery sector, and now I can go be a manager at Walmart. That's nowhere near as high. Not to like put it like, not to like say that's a bad thing, but like imagine if those people could all take their skills and they could go and own and start their own business and run it and like be an active part of the community. We need to have community-based businesses again. So like a lot of times we want to just like fix everything by raising the minimum wage, but really the problem isn't the minimum wage. The problem is that the big businesses are sucking up all of the job competition and exporting like millions and millions of jobs. Like the fact that so many jobs have been created in the past 3 years and it's looked easy and wages are up over $5,000, like that's because it literally was not hard to do, because all we had to do was make it less desirable to get your goods from China and make it more desirable to make them here. Like the fact that Apple just put one of its manufacturing facilities in Texas, like for the past 40 years, all we've been doing is sending our tech and our clothing, our textile, our shoes, even our food. Like, why are we getting beef from China and then we're tearing down all of the farms that we have in the United States? Like, when you look at legitimately how many jobs we just like up and got rid of, like that's why people aren't making enough money is because all of a sudden we've got a few people running everything, and capitalism is meant to have the people running everything. So when we have our businesses, we're setting the wages. There's always other opportunity. You have to have competitive wages and benefits, and you have to treat your employees well. You have a more of a standard, because it's not just dispensable people. It's not just me working for Tyson and being like, hey, we need to treat our chickens better. Like, yeah, it's kind of a messy industry as is, but we shouldn't just be pumping them with chemicals. Like, we should be like raising them and, you know, taking a little bit better care of them, not only for the like morality of like animal treatment, but also the morality of like, I don't want to be eating a chicken that you've injected with like hormones and chemicals and like all this other crazy stuff. Like that's a big thing that's leading to the country's obesity problems and different things like that now, is that we as a country and a society, the food that we eat, no matter how hard you try to eat well and stuff, we don't because it all comes from the same place, is owned by the same people, they use the same techniques, chemicals, stuff like that. Like, even if you try hard to eat healthy, these big businesses are, they're messing up with like the integrity of business, which leads to the, so that also leads to, like I said, less desirable jobs, but also goods. So letting the big businesses run our goods industries, instead of having your 20 people who get their, who like own the grocery stores, and they get their chickens from no farther than 2 hours out from like dozens, if not hundreds of small local farmers. Now we've got way more farmers in business, and we've got higher quality food and a lot more opportunities for jobs that are not just like completely industrialized. And so how a lot of the big businesses has come, and I kind of touched on this, but competition has been allowed to be exported because of trade deals, namely NAFTA. And other ones, deals we've had with China, with Europe, with Canada, with Mexico. And they put all these nice like words and labels on them, and they don't want you to educate yourself on what's actually happening behind the words and the policies and stuff that goes on. They just expect, okay, we elect our people, they tell us they're going to do what's best for us, and we believe them. So the news is going crazy that currently President Trump is going in and changing and removing and pulling out and rewriting all these trade deals that we were in. But when you look at every year with China, we had a $500 billion trade deficit. So every year we lost $500 billion to China because we had like no barriers to entry. We basically had no tariffs. That allowed all of our businesses to just go out, go produce in China, literally ship their stuff all the way, like almost as far around the world as possible, and then sell it, and it's still cheaper than employing someone here and shipping it a mile down the road. And that's partially also because of the terrible human rights conditions in China, which I wrote about, and I'll put that link down there because it's not really what I want to go into today, but it's also a huge part about why we need to, as a country, get back to effective capitalism, not only for the people in this country and for everyone to have a higher quality standard of living here, but because the current giant dominated international or quote-unquote globalized industries that we have today are actually causing terrible human rights violations, not just in the United States in some of the hidden and silent ways, but in quite physical and very inhumane ways throughout the world. So bringing businesses back to the United States not only helps our people get better jobs, and have a higher standard of wealth and less of a gap between wages and between opportunities and stuff. But it'll also force countries like China and countries in Africa and a lot of the other places that our businesses go to exploit, it'll force those governments to make decisions, and without us financing all of their terrible corruption, they'll be forced to, figure out their own problems, like deal with their own things. So the trade deals is kind of a government interference, but that's really a huge part of what has completely eliminated the competition. Why it's easier, why Nike and Adidas owns like 80% of like all of the shoes created, manufactured. You think about like shirts, athletic apparel, all that kind of stuff. When we could have like hundreds of thousands of people here making their own local companies and stuff. So if we can get our international relations and our big businesses in check, we will open up just tons and tons and tons of doors for competition here at home. So yeah, the government can interfere, going off that, and foreign policies. And regulations. And then kind of already talked about this earlier when I was talking about how the people want you to stay, or the people up here want you to stay poor. They go and they use their money and they buy out senators and they do a lot of their lobbying, and they have like crazy huge marketing campaigns, and that's not just like ads, it's like tons and tons and tons of like subliminal marketing and like social re-engineering pretty much goes into keeping people dependent on the government. And that's not even close to just like people in like poorer areas or lower income. Like that's also us. That's like, saying our social security, like we put in all of this money to the government and then they promise they'll give it back to us, or like loans, interest rates, health, and then like even healthcare. Like the more and the more power that we give to the government to control what happens with our money and where that money goes, the more power they have to keep you poor, because as much as they're going to get up there and they're going to tell you that they're working for you and there's all this injustice and they're working for the betterment and the equality of people, but meanwhile the government for the past 100 years has allowed all of this to happen, and then they're gonna turn around and say that by increasing, or like by giving them control of their healthcare, don't worry, we'll take care of it. That really is going to take down the quality of it, because look at, for example, like let's take Apple and Android, I guess. Big businesses, pretty much, for argument's sake, let's just say that those are the only two phones that you can buy if you want the latest technology, all the nice features, the good streaming, the high quality, the good apps, whatever. You pretty much have to go Apple or Android. But that comes at a cost. First of all, the phones, honestly, they've gotten a lot better, but from year to year, they just get like increasingly more expensive without really changing a lot of the fundamental things, or a lot of the issues that like people want fixed, or changes they want made. They won't make, like for example, like the compatibility between Apple and Android, like things like FaceTime and stuff. They'll never fix that because they are doing it to further monopolize and polarize their business. So that just goes to show profit over people already. But then when you look at even crazier things, like I was thinking about getting a new phone because the one I have right now honestly isn't working very well. But I went to the store and literally like all of my options, there were no options without like facial recognition, like required ID, or like touch touch to enter, whatever, and like all that stuff like sounds harmless and it sounds cool, but like when you're as big of a conspiracy theorist, quote unquote, as I am, like you do your research onto like everything like that they're using to track you, like the last thing I want is my phone to have facial recognition, which I'm sure this one honestly does too, but it's just kind of like, so going back to China, the people in Hong Kong are protesting because right now they're separate from China, and for a lot of other reasons, they don't want to become a part of them because their government in the 1900s, because China is technically a democracy, but it's the democracy is completely run and funded. Every area of the government is pretty much controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So while it's a democracy, it's communist. The party rewrote their constitution to make it run more effectively like communism. There's a member of the government in every single business, including newspapers. They're not allowed to write against the government, publish against the government. They've got the internet is on total lockdown by the government, which is why we can't really see as much as the corruption and stuff by like Nike and Apple and Dell and Google. And it's like so it's like sometimes you want to boycott something. Like I can boycott Nike pretty easily, but like every single big tech company we have is overdoing dirty deeds in China and taking advantage of people. So it's like, okay, well, if I want to like boycott them, I just can't have a phone or a computer. And we're hidden from a lot of this corruption because their government and their media wants us not to see it. So they don't let anything, as much as they can, they don't let it leave through the firewalls in China. And our government and our big businesses, but more importantly, because this is where all the power and the money is, our elites don't want us to know either. So the difference between us and China is really like they know they're being censored and manipulated and fed propaganda media, but our country like lies to your face and tells you you're not, even though like we saw with the whole ESPN stuff and Stand With Hong Kong, all the players and the coaches and everyone were told like not to talk about it, not to engage. Supporters like, hey, let's protect these people's human rights to vote and free speech and fair elections and opportunity and like not being controlled. That seems like a pretty like bipartisan thing, but the NBA is like, nope, you can't support these people, like get out of our stadium pretty much. Where was that going? Capitalism. Hong Kong, China. Oh, okay, yeah. So that was a really, really big detour to get to how we're pretty much China, except the only difference is like they know what's happening to them, but a lot of people here don't. Like, so in Hong Kong, the protesters, one of the things they did was they started knocking down their facial recognition towers. Like they literally just like, as frequently as like street lamps you'll see here, like a lot of them are on street lamps, they'll have like cameras and like literally everywhere you go, your phone, your like the street cameras, everything is like constantly running facial recognition technology on you to track everything you do. And in China, that's like a pretty well-known thing. Like there's a physical thing in their reality like that proves to them it happens, as well as they're already a little bit more awake as a country than we are here. And people joke about like, oh, my FBI agent's gonna hear this, whatever. But like the actual reality and possible harm from like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, our Apple and Android devices, like having those features where we're constantly recorded, and all of our data is being downloaded and documented for some future day when they're going to start using it against us more than they already are. Right now, they're using it in more subtle ways to do like social engineering through like Google and Facebook and social media, and the way that things are presented to you on there, and they know how to market you based on what they like hear and see through your phones. So in this monopolized Apple and Android market, it's like I have to get something that's going to tell me it's facial, recognizing my face. It's constantly got a GPS on me. My friend actually told me about this guy who came and spoke at school, and I wish I would have been there, but I didn't know about it. And I guess he made the FBI's like most wanted list because he wanted to like break the algorithm in his phone, because your phone like always knows where you're going to be going and what you're going to be doing, because they're tracking you. And so he made the FBI's most wanted list by like leaving his phone at home or leaving it at work overnight, or just like doing really weird patterns with what he was doing with his phone. And it was like caused enough alarm that like he became a suspected terrorist, because if you want to do some research on the Patriot Act, you'll realize why all of this data that the big tech companies and stuff steal from you is so important. Because if you read it, pretty much that act gave the intelligence agencies the right to like, so again, the FBI agent joke, it gave them the right to monitor you at all times, because not only because like quote unquote like anybody could be a terrorist, but because of the way they define it. So it's not just like they are using it to monitor everybody, but like when you look into the nitty-gritty of it, it's not just like looking for people involved in ISIS and stuff. It's like anyone, in the way that like in China you can go to jail for speaking out against your government, or like disagreeing with the status quo or the propaganda media and stuff. Like in the past 10 or so years, the Patriot Act has allowed for the government pretty much to find and silence people who disagreed with them in whatever manner, and have used that act to actively buy our data from all these companies, and do unallowed we did not give them, well, we kind of did, but like we technically, like, they don't have permission to surveil us, or like, oh my gosh, the Google Homes and Amazon Alexas and stuff, like we don't have those in my house. Like I think I would get kicked out if I bought one, but like this stuff like that, the amount of surveillance they're really doing on you, and when you look into it, why they're doing it is just crazy. And moral of the story is that's why they allow those businesses to be so powerful and stuff, because when you start to put all the pieces together, it really, you start to understand more how like it makes sense that we have the illusion of capitalism. Like when you put together like the different things, like in capitalism there should be almost no government. They're just making sure like no one's taking advantage of the systems, no one's getting too big, ironically, pretty much keeping it in line, trying to be, it's ironically supposed to be there to be like the moral compass, but not in the way where they decide what's moral and not. They're just supposed to execute the law, like make sure businesses aren't stealing from one another, making sure people get paid what they're due. Just, you're pretty much supposed to be facilitating, not completely taking over and creating. And then when you add in all of the handouts and all of the ways the government has started making these little like subsectors and put their control into a lot of the business that goes on in the United States. You start to realize like maybe our system isn't working capitalistically the way it's supposed to be. And then the only other two things I've got is income tax. That's it. Okay, this is the part where I'm going to start cheating a little bit. Okay, so pretty much, so we've talked about why it's not working, and hopefully that helps you see a little bit as to why it's not working in the areas like we've been told it should be or shouldn't be working, or things should be happening one way and it's not. And it's like, if you don't take the time to like really start researching and like figure out what's like really going on, then pretty much the government and the media and the politicians can just tell you whatever it is they want to tell you, and we'll believe it and we'll buy it because they sound like they have our best intentions in mind, when in reality they don't. So let's see, just to review competition. Let's talk about the benefits just to get them up here on the board. In the pink we've got the barriers. So what we want is quality products. We want to have the opportunity for good technology, for good food, for products that we believe in, for products that are humanely made, for products that just contribute to the well-being of society, I think, or even like that work the way you want them to, like the fact that our phones will break 2 years after buying them, and we don't really have a choice about it, or just the whole built to break instead of built to last. That comes from this big business and debt-based model that we live in. So then, and I did mention some of these earlier, we want competitive wages, which will come from the opportunity of more businesses, more things running, fair cost, because we only have Apple and Android providing phones, even if really we could be buying a brand new phone of the exact same quality for $500 or less, because we only have two companies that manufacture, and well, they don't manufacture it, that's how they get the loopholes on the human rights, but that sell phones. Like, they can charge us whatever they want and make the prices go up every year, and there's not a lot we can do about it. Said also variety of needs, increase opportunity, that's at every level. We also want to increase an energized workforce, so not just hating your job, showing up in a cubicle, working because you have to, working because the man says you have to, or like, and then most importantly, we haven't mentioned this yet, but less hours working. So another thing that the elite class wants from us, in keeping us poor and keeping us in debt and taxing us and taking all of the money for us, and this is huge. So, and this also goes back to why we shouldn't just raise the minimum wage, because that'll just send the entire broken system already into more chaos. Because when capitalism is working efficiently and effectively, you're going to work less hours. We're gonna get back to an 8-hour or less work day. When you're in debt and you have bills to pay and you have and you have interest, like you have interest rates out your butt on hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that you owe for college, for your house, and for your car, and meanwhile you're trying to feed your family and do everything else it is you want to do. A lot of times people are ending up working 2 and 3 jobs, and that's not because of the minimum wage inherently. It's because like the lack of competition and the government interference is has driven the wages to be so low and the price of goods to be so high, and we're constantly paying off interest that we shouldn't be paying. So once things get like more competitive and like more businesses accelerating, like that's why it's so great that we're bringing all these jobs back home, because it's also bringing like entire businesses back home. Tons of people are starting their own jobs right now. There's just tons of opportunity, and so when like the entire country is working together to take care of itself basically. So like let's take it down to a small community, the city that you live in. Instead of having, you know, a Walmart, Starbucks, and like a Dick's Sporting Goods, we've got a couple family-owned stores buying from family-run farms. We've got a local person, like we've got local people running their own coffee shops. We've got people selling different sporting goods, making things. Like when our communities become self-sufficient, or we have local doctors working for local people, so we have more doctors who spend time on less clients instead of just pushing them in and out, jacking them up with medicine. We have, you know, go back to the like doctors that you know, and they work on you and getting you into a healthier lifestyle. Like they'll still be paid well because it's an incredibly important like job, and there is a lot of times that medicine is necessary. But if we can get back to our local people taking care of our local problems, then everyone will be all hands on deck, and it's not just like this constant like crunching profit, because your smaller communities will inherently become more profitable. The money will stay local, and the money will get what needs to be done, instead of just like having people working at these crunching jobs and then trying to get everything done on top of it. And then this is huge too. We'll talk about the benefits of a smaller government, which for those of you who don't know, before the Trump presidency and stuff, I was really centrally minded. I leaned conservative because of one reason, and one reason only, because I understood that no matter what was happening in the country or in the world, that a limited government was the one thing that I really believed in. And I think, and the more I research, I am starting to understand how greatly important this point right here is. So some benefits of having a limited government are, most importantly, and this is the big one, citizen power and influence. So if you remember what the country was founded on really was the fact that a lot of these people were fleeing from countries in Europe and different backgrounds where the governments had gotten too big, the religious organizations had too much power over the people, and this is where we really need to learn from history, and history repeating itself. We can learn from China and Hong Kong today and see the similarities in China 100 years ago, us today, or even us today versus them today, and seeing how similar it is and what they're going through. But we can also learn from, our own history, our founding fathers, who when they came, they had one thing they wanted to drive home more than anything else, and that was that we needed to make sure that the citizens had their power, and the citizens would never lose their power, because they said once the people do, and there's hundreds of millions of us, and maybe hundreds of thousands, being generous, of the above the elite class, pretty much like having all of us united together, and having our power. That's why the scariest thing for them is for us not only to have money, but more importantly for us to have knowledge of what's going on, is because that just makes us all the more powerful against them and what they're doing to us. So having a limited government means that pretty much we decide the rules. We will regulate the wages, we'll regulate how workers are treated, and yes, there should be laws that make sure that companies can't abuse it, but really, when you put the power back into the people, most normal people, your family members, your friends, most of the people in your life are good people and are going to want to do good things for one another. And pretty much, if you take these giant corporation money pushing heads out of the equation, and you put just hundreds of thousands of local businesses, the people are going to do good things for one another and for their employees, and they're going to want to pay them well, and if they don't, there's going to be somewhere else that they can go to work, and that's another way how competition if it's not a place people want to work, if it's a place where the people aren't treated well, they're not paid well, if you don't take care of the people that work for you, they're just going to go work somewhere else, or better yet, they're going to learn what you're doing, and then they're going to go open the same business, but they're going to treat their people right. So it filters out a lot of the corruption, because if people aren't happy, they won't go work there and won't do those things. So if we put the power and influence back into the people and take it away from the hands of the government, this works more effectively and people are better taken care of. Then we've got kind of what I was saying, goods satisfy needs. And by that I mean we're not forced to shop at Kroger, where every single brand of chicken that is for sale, no matter how they market it, is coming from Tyson, who's pumping their chickens with all of these hormones and chemicals and whatever. And then, you go to Wendy's, McDonald's, almost every fast food restaurant chain except for Chick-fil-A pretty much. Even Buffalo Wild Wings got bought out by Arby's, who uses Tyson chicken or something like that. All the chicken comes from the same place. So yes, we have an infinite supply of chicken. I don't think I've ever seen a grocery store or anything ever run out of chicken, but we're getting this chicken that's super unhealthy for you, causing health problems, obesity, heart problems the older you get. And even with a lot of food, there's a lot of evidence that says even different cancers and just tons of different health issues are coming from, we don't have goods that satisfy our yes, we're not starving, but it's not satisfying our needs in the way our body needs to function well. And processed goods, another thing, it's not just physical health, but mental health. The emission given off by Apple and Android devices, the chemicals and stuff pumped into your food, or the over marketing of sugary stuff and having unhealthy foods, which this some people, there's an argument over whether it's true or not, but I guess low cost, easier access to unhealthy and what's it called? Not produced, processed foods all of that is leading into all these giant health issues. And it's like, okay, well, our government is letting our big businesses, our big food businesses, make us unhealthy, and then they want to tell us that if we give them money, they'll pay for our health care, when really, why don't we just cut the cord over there and have food that makes us healthier, have a lifestyle that makes us healthier, and have doctors whose goal is to increase our the health of our lifestyle, before we just say, well, if we give you money, then you can fix it. Because then all of a sudden, let's say, I've heard like all kinds of different ways on how they're going to like redistribute like who your doctors are and stuff. But like, just for argument's sake, let's say now there's 10 companies who we all have universal health care, and it all comes from these 10 companies. Well, now we have no power, no control, and no influence, aside from maybe a vote for who we put in office to take care of it. But as we know, the people you vote for oftentimes don't have your best interests in mind and don't make the best decisions. So now we have no influence, because we can't change who is our healthcare, the doctor we see. Maybe we can or maybe we can't, but regardless, is all of the doctors are going to be working for the same system. So if they decide that our government healthcare isn't going to cover mental health, and it's like, well, that's a big portion of like where your healthcare goes, or they're not going to cover like certain diseases, whereas today you could choose like, oh, I'll take this healthcare plan because this fits my needs or whatever. Now it's like, well, you have all these cookie cutters, and if we don't have what you need, sorry about it. But as well as not only like not having your power and influence, like even less than we already do, because like the system is broken. There is a lot that we need to fix it, but we need to do that by using our power and influence, and educating people and informing people and speaking up on issues and forcing change, instead of just thinking that we can elect officials and hand our money over and that all of our problems will like instantaneously be solved. Because the same way the chicken that we have options to have isn't always the best, like the same thing will happen with healthcare. And we have this government that knows that the food is making the people unhealthy and is causing more health issues, but they just want to fix it with money instead of fixing it at the root of its problem. So that's why in both the healthcare and food instance, in terms of if we call them goods, where it would be better to have more citizen power, because the goods would satisfy our needs better than they would if they're under control of the government. And then, like I said, how the government would be like, they would still police, like make sure people were following the rules, but like when capitalism is working effectively, people have a lot more power in setting the standards for, like I said, payment and like working quality in hours, but like also just overall morality, how you want to treat things, people, your business, when it's not just coming from a few like money crunching sources. We have a lot more say and leeway over the morality, and I think that the 99% of us are infinitely more moral than the people who run the Federal Reserve, the big businesses, and our government. And then lastly, when you have people making money, and you have people having opportunity, and you have businesses that genuinely care about and want to take care of their people, we're not going to need these things. Like, we're not going to need government assistance, we're not going to be dependent, and right now, because of how much corruption is in our government and in the systems that run above it, that's really their end goal, is to keep you in debt and to keep you dependent on them and to keep you voting to stay dependent on them. And that's why there's so many minorities who, the movement's called the walk away movement. There's so many people who are realizing that, like, the goal for the past 100 years is to keep everyone poor and keep the poor the poorest. Like, they just want us all dependent on them so that they can control how we vote, how we work, how we think, act, speak, whatever. Yeah. It's all pretty much just to keep us dependent on them. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for the capitalism aspect. So just to review, when capitalism is working well, we've got the stuff in green, and the stuff in red is kind of what we talked about. We could call them like the barriers to capitalism that we have right now, or like the barriers, or like what's creating the illusion of capitalism. Like in my last video, we talked about how the media, 6 companies own 90% of the media, and when you realize, well, that's happening in almost every industry, whether it's the media or food or coffee or grocery stores or cars or whatever it is, there's like hundreds and thousands of different names and like small businesses that like you think, oh, it might be a chain, but then when you realize like, okay, this one small chain, well, this big company actually owns 10 small chains, and then you realize like, oh, all of those brands are all owned by the same thing. So the same thing that's happening in the media, where 6 companies own 90%, is like happening across the board, and because of all the things we talked about today, that's leaving us with the illusion of capitalism instead of actual capitalism. So the people who want to change the way our economy is working, like, I don't disagree with them. I think we all understand that there's a problem, but you know, they want us to just sit down here and fight. So they're trying to tell a lot of people like, oh, dude, socialism's the answer. But then a lot of the people, like for example, a lot of families who are like small business owners, like see more directly, like more firsthand, the way that these like pink or purple red factors have slowly creeped in over the past several decades and made an impact on their industry, and they see it happen firsthand. And a lot of times, like, those are the people who are realizing, wait a second, like, the problem isn't capitalism, it's problem that the capitalism system that we have is broken and is not working well and is threatening jobs instead of being an open market for creating them. So that's about it there. And I'm going to go into a little bit, because I keep talking about the people who are above the 1% and above the elite that run everything. I'm going to limit how many of their names I use, because the easiest way to get kicked off of YouTube is to start saying some of the names that run here, own that, own everything else. So pretty much I'm going to use the board a little bit more here too, just so I don't get in trouble. So it's kind of interesting, conspiracy theorist to me. In 1913, we've got 13 families who at this point have bought out a lot of things. They've bought out like the railroads, the energy, the coal, the food, the banks. Most importantly, the banks. They've bought out the health insurance. They're starting to make their way into running with the government, influencing policy and stuff like that. And so I'm going to give you one example, and this is actually something you can find on the CIA's website. So call me a conspiracy theorist all you want, but literally there's like a 200-page document or something, at least one. This is only one I've looked at. I looked at like 2 or 3 specific pages on this family. I'm not even going to say their name. So we've got this family right there is like the biggest family out of all of them. They've run a lot of the money. They're one of the ones that from the very beginning they knew what they knew what their goal was, to buy up everything and to one day take over this country. And so these families, which like equals like thousands and thousands of people at this point based on their offspring and the people who work with them, they're very big and they're silent. So to put into perspective, most of the people who have money in these families, the Forbes list, because I'm pretty sure if they don't own Forbes, one of the families does. The Forbes list literally will not put any of the people above the elite 1% on the Forbes list, literally because it would all be made up of those people in those families. And like if we knew the amount of money they had, like I think that alone would cause an uprising. But one way they get away with it is by this family will hire people in other families or hire individuals, oftentimes mind-controlled individuals or very tightly money and blackmail controlled individuals to do their dirty work, run their families or their companies. And another way is sometimes they'll buy 95% of the shares of a stock. That way sometimes it doesn't look like they own a company even though they do, or they'll spread out that 95% of stock between, like, say their 3 kids or like their kids and their wife, or the way the stock is spread, it all trickles up back to like one guy right there. So that's how in some ways they've been able to get away from people knowing how much they actually own. They've got quite a few tricks on how they do that, but right now I'm going to highlight some of the businesses that they own, just put into perspective. So this family alone, like not even the people underneath of them, but they have 17 at least Fortune 500 companies. 17 Fortune 500 companies. And so a lot of them, so this is where it gets interesting. A lot of them own, all the families that I guess together own all of the energy companies around the world, which is why we so often go to war over oil and stuff like that, because it's really part of their game. So this family specifically owns General Electric, General Motors, American Motors, which you'll remember we talked about earlier, how when we had the bailout, it was the banks and the car companies. A lot of the American car companies were part of that bailout too. And again, all of that trickles up back to here. So that has to make you think a little bit more about what's really going on, because this family controls this. So we've got General Motors, American Motors, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, Colt Firearms, Standard Oil Company, Exxon Corporation, Sherwin-Williams, and Heinz. Let's see. I think some of the ones on my next list are Fortune 500 too. This was as of 1980 as well. So while some of it has shifted a little bit, I'm sure I didn't double check everything, but these are still very profitable, very well-known companies, and I would say it's pretty safe to say that most of these companies are still Fortune 500. And then they've got Sears, the home insurance company, Mutual Life Insurance Company, Duke Power Company, textile, cotton, gold, silver, iron, steel, 30 plus banks. They own 30 plus banks, including Chase, JP Morgan, and then a few named after some people who we'll get back to in a minute. So, I mean, if you look at industries, and this is not even 5% of all of the companies they own. They're just some of the biggest ones you'll know. So they have over 30 banks, which when you look at your local banks and everything and watch how they trickle up, I'd be surprised if even that many have influence on this. And there's a couple other families who influence the Federal Reserve as well. So that just goes to show how much of it is owned by these people right here. Let's see. And then we've got tons of energy companies, over 40 food and household companies. So even though, like we're talking about, a lot of the food is owned by one company, when you look at a lot of the other companies, even those trickle back to this. So when you think about how much influence this one family has over hundreds and, I mean, I have 100 on this paper, probably thousands of companies that like this family owns, and then you think about how much money they have and how much influence money has over the government, you start to realize like, wow, maybe like they have power, they have so much power over everything, and these families are very heavily integrated into Hollywood and the media, and so all that stuff that we talked about last week or a couple weeks ago trickles up to families like this. When you start to put it all together and you see the money, the food, the healthcare, the energy, like there's, if you do some research on it, well, it's kind of hard to research, but pretty much the thing about global warming, aside from the fact that the media will only cite, they'll only cite certain scientists, they won't cite both. Let's say there's pretty even numbers of scientists on both sides of the argument. It is a problem, it isn't a problem, or it is a problem, but it's not as big of a problem, whatever. The fact that the media only depicts the research of one type of person, which you'll see that all over. You'll see that happening in medicine. In fact, the FDA is trying to attack the CBD industry, and they're citing like 2 scientists, even though there's hundreds of scientists and thousands, if not millions, of people who have tried it and worked it for themselves, who say it works. But the FDA is going off of the two scientists or whatever to say it could be problematic. When you start to look at how all of it functions in your society, it sort of starts to make more sense that like, oh, maybe like these people don't have my best interests in mind. And so that's, I don't know where I was going with that. Okay, but so then this family who owns, again, like I said, the two big ones are energy and banks. And they also own food and health. So that goes back to your big businesses and your healthcare, why we see a lot of people acting the way that they are. A guy whose name has been showing up a lot recently right here. He has a lot to do with the current way they're acting, because like when I or like the president or a lot of people are when we're like criticizing like the Democrat Party right now, it's not, first of all, most importantly, it's not the individuals. Like I said, we all have way more in common than we do differently, and it's not even entirely you know, like what the individual people, lower level people think. Like, again, I think we all have a lot more in common. We all want what's best for each other. Like, the problem is not the differences that we have in the ways that we want to solve problems always per se, but there's been like a massive giant shift in the two-party system. And so right now it's completely changing, and this guy who is one of the heads of one of these families is pretty much funding everything going on in the party right now, from like the impeachment to the candidates who are running, and he's always been highly influential in the candidates running, but previously it didn't matter who we elected. These people's agenda was going to get taken care of. And now that that's not the case, we're seeing a lot of the politicians and elites and higher up people acting in very extreme ways, because they know that people are starting to wake up to this, and they're starting to wake up to the fact that the media is corrupt, and wake up to the fact that their food is coming from bad places, and they're waking up to all of it. And so that's why these people who have controlled so much of everything for so long are terrified. So he plays a big role in the Democrat Party, but they're definitely not even alone. Like, this is not even a handful. This is just kind of the big ones. So this family, one of the families that they employed, I guess, they're not one of the original families, but pretty much right before the 1900s, they hired them on to buy or run some of their businesses so that it looked like they didn't own as many as they did. And so today, this family is pretty heavily influential. This family already had a lot of influence in banking as well, especially in Europe. That's kind of where they got their start. They were starting to buy up things in the United States when they made it over here, but really they would have not have gotten anywhere near to where they are today if they hadn't joined forces with these guys. But you gotta remember, this family is still like the head honcho. Like, literally think of it as like a family mob. Like, it's literally one of the most organized crime systems ever to be known, and we're gonna hopefully a lot of it will start to come to light a little bit more soon. But when you've got this family, there is a certain ex-presidential candidate who is part of that family. So it just goes to show they're not just over there. And then if you want to, these are just a couple examples. It's not really on topic of the economy anymore. So then we've got, well, let's see. So then we've got the Federal Reserve. Let's go back to that. So in 1913, so this is why they always say we're never more than a generation away from losing our freedom, which is true. And we're never more than like 2 or 3 generations away from losing information, because there's the idea that the heroes or the winners always write history, and that's what we see even within our own recent history. a lot of things that people will remember happening, or like, shoot, even just our news. Like, our news will report something that is happening that is completely like the opposite of what actually happened, but that's what's going to like be documented in history, because the news has the power, and what they say happened. Whatever. So it's kind of a shame that like a lot of the people that were alive for this are no longer with us, because in the research I've been doing, they talk about how the people at that time like were in an uproar. They did not want to have a centralized bank. It is the third time in history that we have had one. There have been 2 presidents who have been taken out. They had a lot in common, the conspiracy between that, because they wanted to get rid of centralized banking. Most recently, that was JFK and Abraham Lincoln. One thing they both had in common was they wanted to get rid of centralized banking because they knew how much power it gave to a few people and took away from the citizens. Got him right there. Yeah, so some of the families that run this are names that you'll recognize, so I'll throw some of those up here somewhere. Hope you can see that. Oh, this one was my favorite find. I don't know if there's an actual relationship, but based on how much family names, if your family name gets carried on and then you're put into a position of power, like usually they like to hide it a step or two, but in some cases they don't. So that's one of them. And then you've got, I said them earlier, JP Morgan. I don't think that one will be triggering because it's the name of a real bank. Oh, this one's a good one. This family, and you can easily find the relationship between this family, who again is a Federal Reserve family, and what's his name? Oh, and Anderson Cooper, the CNN anchor. His mom actually was Gloria Vanderbilt, one of the more prominent Vanderbilts. So that's one of the more obvious examples of the connection that there is between the money and the government and the media. There's quite literally, and there's even a ton of other people. There's other great videos on it connecting tons of owners, CEOs, other executives and stuff, and the marriages between people who come down here, or like people who are like executives and CEOs in the media who are quite literally married to a congressman or woman. Like, all of the connections between the money, the government, and the media is insane. But here we've got good old Anderson Cooper, which explains even further a little bit why CNN, not even CNN itself, but CNN is funded by these guys, and they're pretty much in place to protect the interests of these families. And so you'll see then why they hate Trump so much, because he's out to destroy everything that they have in place, which is good for you and I, but it just kind of explains a little bit why they hate him so aggressively, because it's not just another political, it's not just another like political thing at stake. It's quite literally going to change the face of the future this next election, and it really has to do a lot with which power structure we're going to vote in, whether we're going to give the power back to the people, strongly enforce the Constitution, revitalize capitalism, and hopefully in his next term we'll be able to start attacking big business a little bit more. Right now he's kind of power checking them, at least for now, making them bring jobs back to the United States and start to be proactive on that end. But right now, too soon to see a ton of big changes here and here quite yet, but I definitely think that they're coming, and I don't think it'll be forced either. I think it'll just be like people are gonna wake up to realize like how corrupt all of these companies, like I think once they learn and have the access to like all of the like disgusting things they've been doing to humanity and to our bodies and like food and stuff, I think naturally as a population we're gonna reject this ourselves. I don't think the government is really gonna have to do anything to change it there. I think it's really gonna come down to the people learning and understanding what's happening. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't seen my one on the media and the monopolization of the media, go check it out because it'll explain a little bit more in a case study on how all of these monopolies have been able to exist legally, and how now that you know a little bit of what you know about these families, understanding how those 6 companies are all working for the rights and the goods of these people, that might help you understand a little bit more why we're seeing the things happen in the media that we're seeing happen, and seeing a little bit more how it's possible that our society can look like a full-run capitalistic society, because we see all these brand names and all these businesses and all that stuff, when really it's all just trickling up back to the top and we're just kind of playing their game. So if you haven't seen my first video, go check it out. I hope that you learned something today. I tried to stay pretty to the book, but I did get off topic a little bit sometimes or go on a political rant. But the goal of this video wasn't really supposed to like change the way you vote, but just to change the way that you see the economy as a whole, or the business environment, or to think a little bit differently maybe about where our society is at versus where we should want it to be heading. So I hope you enjoyed this video, hope you'll give it a share, and I'll see you next time.